Hello and welcome to Slow Night Ancient Tales. Tonight we bring you Yi Hyo-seok's short story, A Rose Falls Ill. Two actors, Hyeon-bo and Nam-juk, find their theater troupe suddenly collapsed, leaving them stranded with nowhere to go. What begins with a chance glimpse of a street fight becomes a brief, melancholy reunion between two people who haven't seen each other in 7 years. Let this story of restless hearts, carried along by the currents of their time, walk you gently into sleep tonight. Of all the fights in this world, few were as short, as absurd, and yet as revealing of the very nature of fighting itself. It wasn't the kind of brawl where two men strike and kick and curse each other until they collapse from exhaustion. It simply ended in being struck, falling, and surrendering. Clean, sharp, like a few frames cut from the middle of some long-forgotten film. Perhaps it was that very freshness of impression that made Hyeon-bo and Nam-juk stop in their tracks as they passed by, just having left the cinema. But by the time they joined the crowd of onlookers, the fight was already nearly over. It was evening in a back alley cluttered with cinemas, restaurants, and cafes, right in front of a restaurant with a bamboo curtain hanging over its door. Two men in white cook's uniforms were fighting. One heavy-set and powerful, the other thin and dark-skinned. Perhaps the outcome had already been decided by their builds alone. Words had failed, it seemed, and the fight had turned to fists. And as the two grappled, the thin man's sharp, vicious blow made the bigger man stagger for a moment, before he drove his fist, doubled in force, straight into his opponent's face. The thin man crashed backward with a cry, knocking over a potted plant by the door, which shattered and spilled its juniper onto the ground. Clutching his face, he staggered up and lunged forward again, only to be knocked down once more by a second blow. His face, scraped raw against the ground, bled in dark patches, two thin trails of blood trickling from his nose. Though clearly exhausted and nearly limp, he forced himself up once more and threw himself at the bigger man, who simply stepped aside, sending him sprawling without so much as landing a blow. For a long moment, only the sound of ragged breathing broke the silence, until blood began spreading slowly across the dry ground. "I lose," a short cry, bitter but final. And with that, the fight was over. "You surrender?" The bigger man showed not the slightest change, looking down at his opponent with an unbothered, almost lazy calm. "It's just that I'm out of strength. I wouldn't surrender so easily otherwise. Come at me again once you've got some strength back in those bones. Until then, I'll let you keep your life." As the thin man answered with quiet dignity and lifted his bloodied face, Hyeon-bo felt a chill run through him at the gruesome sight, and without thinking, tugged at Nam-juk's sleeve. Nam-juk, too, turned her face away and quickly walked off. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The emotion stirred by that sudden, chance encounter was simply too great, strong and weak, winning and losing. Only these two paths, terribly simple. In that brief fight, where the weak was helplessly beaten down before the strong, the two of them felt as though they had glimpsed the very shape of their era. "Isn't it beautiful? Like a scene cut from a film?" "Isn't it sad?" Nam-juk asked, her eyes glistening with tears. Was the beauty she saw a kind of sympathy for the loser? Beautiful because it was sad, sad enough to be beautiful. Hyeon-bo, too, dimly sensed that this feeling had risen from the very air of the era they lived in, and led Nam-juk into a tea house on the corner. Even as they drank their tea, neither of them could quite shake the lingering weight of that fight. It wasn't unpleasant so much as it was sorrowful. The film they had just seen was called The Witness, a scene of an old mother and a young child gazing toward a grave at dusk, having lost their father to a wrongful accusation, and a scene beneath a bridge in the slums where the poor danced to a street musician's hand organ before being chased off by the police. Both had brought tears to Nam-juk's eyes. Before that sorrow had even faded, they had come upon the street fight, and all those feelings had merged into fresh tears. In truth, Nam-juk's own circumstances were already worse than any tears could express. She had only just been released, a few days earlier, after more than 2 weeks of hardship. Shabbily dressed, with an empty purse, she had no way to return home, and nowhere else to turn either. 2 weeks earlier, the newly formed theater troupe Culture Stage had left Seoul for a regional tour, only to collapse suddenly in this very city, for no clear reason at all. Hyeon-bo, who had written the script, happened to be from this city and was released unexpectedly quickly. Nam-juk, too, was soon released. But Min-sam, who had financed the production, In-soo, the director, the actor Hak-jun, and several others were still being held. Though they had been released first, Hyeon-bo and Nam-juk couldn't help but think of their remaining companions, and of their own uncertain situation, and felt endlessly gloomy. For Hyeon-bo, who had been drifting through the streets doing nothing in particular, and for Nam-juk, who had once dreamed of becoming a singer, then an actress, the founding of the troupe had been a spark of hope and purpose, only for that unexpected blow to knock the wind out of them both, leaving them right back where they'd started. That the two of them had met again here, of all places, was itself an extraordinary coincidence. 7 years earlier, while Hyeon-bo was still in school in Seoul, he had come to know the sisters Se-juk and Nam-juk through their bookshop, Daejungwon. Even as a young girl back then, Nam-juk had devoured progressive literature, and Hyeon-bo had come to see her as a beautiful, healthy flower, full of tender sentiment and yearning dreams. But after finishing school and leaving Seoul, all contact was lost. And he had only heard, second-hand, that the bookshop Daejungwon had closed. Now 7 years later, meeting her again under the stage name Hyeon, Hyeon-bo could still see, faintly clinging on, a trace of her old dreams. But he could also clearly sense that this flower had, somewhere along the way, begun to wither and fall ill. Leaving the tea house, the two of them made their way to a department store to meet Hyeon-bo's friend Jung-gu. What Nam-juk desperately needed now was the fare to get home. Home, to the wide plains of Susong, where her sister Se-juk farmed the land and raised goats. Asking a poor schoolteacher like Jung-gu for money didn't sit easily with Hyeon-bo. But when they met, Jung-gu, his face damp with sweat, spoke honestly of his own struggling household, and without hesitation pulled out a single crumpled bill. "I'm sorry it's so little, but please, take it and put it to use." Holding that bill in his hand, Hyeon-bo felt a sharp ache in his chest, his eyes stinging with heat. But the amount fell far short of even a fifth of what they truly needed. After parting with Jung-gu, the two of them wandered the night streets aimlessly, their hearts heavy. Eventually, they found themselves in a modest little bar where Nam-juk, without hesitation, downed several glasses of strong gin. As the drink took hold, she rose to dance to the record playing, and a stranger nearby, a wealthy playboy known around town for his reputation, stepped over and asked her to dance. Hyeon-bo's chest tightened uncomfortably as Nam-juk accepted without a moment's pause. Eventually, a waitress rushed over amid the commotion to put a stop to the dancing, and Hyeon-bo hurried Nam-juk, still unsteady on her feet, out of the bar. However much of a playboy he may be, to be so forward with a total stranger, what an unpleasant man. At Hyeon-bo's disapproval, Nam-juk only laughed and replied, "There's no need to be upset. Among people who dance, asking someone to dance isn't an insult. It's a form of respect, real, why, and he seemed rather skilled at it too." Then, still flushed with drink, Nam-juk suddenly began reciting right there on the street a passage from O'Neill's Ile. It was the scene of a woman trapped in the Arctic ice, pleading with her husband, the ship's captain, and somehow it sounded exactly like her own desperate plea. This life is killing me. This cold, this silence. I'm going mad. If you love me, please, take me home. The next day, Hyeon-bo took Nam-juk, still not quite recovered from the drink, out to the river for some fresh air. The water was crowded with pleasure boats, the whole scene alive with summer merriment. As they rowed toward the island, Nam-juk quietly tore up a letter from her sister, news that the goat's milk had grown scarce and that travel money was hard to come by, and let the pieces drift away on the water. Then, wistfully, she described the white embankment stretching straight toward the sea in front of her village, the summers spent herding goats along its length, and the fragrant pine mushrooms she gathered come early autumn. As they neared the island, Nam-juk, stepping down onto the shore, lost her footing and fell straight into the river. Hyeon-bo rushed in and pulled her out, but both of them were now soaked through. With no choice but to avoid the crowds, they found a secluded sunlit spot on the island to dry their clothes. Standing there, half-dressed and looking rather absurd, the two of them suddenly caught each other's eye and burst out laughing. Unable to bear sending her home alone in that state, Hyeon-bo walked her back to her lodging that evening, and that night, for the first time, the two of them stayed together late into the night. It wasn't a feeling that had come from one side alone, but something that had quietly built between them, slowly, over the 7 years since they'd first known each other, finally spilling over. In the days that followed, Hyeon-bo did not go to see Nam-juk. He wanted to raise the money for her journey home first, so that he might meet her again with a clear conscience. But having already leaned on his friend Jung-gu once, there was nowhere else left to turn. After days of anguished thought, Hyeon-bo finally did something he knew was wrong. He took his family's postal savings passbook without permission. With the money finally in hand, he went to Nam-juk's inn, only to find the room empty. Thinking she had simply gone out, he returned home, and there, on his desk, found a postcard she had left for him. "Why haven't you come by these past few days? I hope you're not upset with me. I've troubled you enough as it is, and now that I have the fare, I'm leaving right away. I imagine it won't be easy for us to meet again after this. Take care always." Rushing back to the inn, Hyeon-bo was met with an unexpected story from the old innkeeper. The night before she left, her purse had seemed rather full, the woman said, and the man behind it, it turned out, was none other than that same wealthy playboy who had asked Nam-juk to dance at the bar days before. So that's where the money came from. A bitter, self-mocking smile crossed Hyeon-bo's lips. All at once, the 7 years of Nam-juk's life he had never known seemed to unfold before his eyes. Feeling utterly deceived, he wandered the streets in a daze, hardly aware of where he was going. And then, a few days later, Hyeon-bo's own body began to show signs of something wrong. Ashamed, he finally went to see a doctor, and received the diagnosis he had already come to dread. It felt as though he had been deceived in both heart and body at once, and yet, more than resentment, he found himself overwhelmed with an aching pity for Nam-juk. He couldn't reconcile the bright, sharp-minded girl who had once read late into Tooth. He night in the back room of that bookshop, debating ideas with anyone who'd listen, with the woman she had become now, fallen ill in more ways than one. That night, weighed down by all of it, Hyeon-bo returned to the same bar, and there once again he crossed paths with the wealthy playboy. The man approached without a trace of shame, offering him a drink, and said, "Well, no use hiding it now, is there? Frankly, it cost me more than I bargained for. I've been drinking beer here every night since. They say it helps, though who knows when this'll finally clear up. You and I, we're not so different after all. Come on, let's drown our sorrows together tonight, one to another. Unable to laugh, unable to be angry, Hyeon-bo could only sit there in silence, his face frozen somewhere between the two. That's tonight's story. The brief, melancholy summer shared by two people caught in the currents of their era lingers long after the story ends. We hope you felt alongside us Yi Hyo-seok's delicate psychological insight and the restless, uncertain portrait of youth in 1930s colonial Korea. Tonight, set down whatever weighs on your heart and let yourself drift into quiet sleep. Have a warm night. Sleep well.